Hello, this is my tutorial on different performance skills keywords, and in particular this one is looking at voice. So I'm going to talk through some of the keywords, give you a bit of the definition of them, and some of them are for examples as well. Most of these you've probably heard of before. Some of them might be completely new, or even you might know them in a different subject. Now, I just kind of want to explain a little bit here about different tiers of words, okay? So you have tier one words. They're your words that you use like every day. So who, what, where, those kind of generic words that aren't specific to anything, okay? Then your next layer, you have some of your command words. These are tier two words. And these are things like explain or evaluate and analyze. Then you get onto your tier three words, and these are your subject specific words. And this will be the same for every single subject that you do, okay? That they will have their own set of words that you might know, but they might mean something different to a different subject, okay? So please bear this in mind. And when I'm talking about a word that you think you might know from music, for example, just make sure you know the drama definition, okay? So the drama definition we're after, not the music or PE or geography definition or whatever it could be. Okay, so the first keyword we're going to look at is volume. Again, this is one you probably already know, and this is how loud or how quiet your voice is. Okay, that was quiet if it was too quiet to hear. Pretty simple. How an actor uses volume is to maybe show emotion or maybe to show how they're hiding or the events of the play. Okay. Clarity, the next one. Clarity is how clear you are speaking. So if I'm like mumbling, be like, oh yeah, this is when the actor speaks clearly. That isn't speaking with clarity. You need to make sure that you're speaking so the audience can hear you. Okay. Pace. This one, again, is probably one of those tier three words that means maybe something different in a different subject, but it's basically how fast or slow the actor is talking. So if, for example, you've got a character that's really, really stressed and nervous, they might be speaking with a faster pace. Okay, so they might be talking really, really fast because they're really nervous and they're really worried, etc. Okay. Emphasis. Now, emphasis, ironically, I just did there, is when you make a word stand out in a sentence or phrase. So those of you that have seen Friends, you know that Chandler has this thing where he says, could I be more annoying, or whatever the phrase might be, but the emphasis sits on that word be. It stands out. What they've done is they've changed the volume or the pitch, which again is another word we're going to go on to in a second, and they made it stand out. This can often be used in things such as sarcasm or when people are angry and they need to make a point of something. Usually emphasis is tied with a gesture too, so you notice that I'm quite gestural when I'm speaking, and it's because I am emphasizing some of the key words I'm saying. Okay. Pitch. Pitch is how high or how low your voice goes, and it can change from character to character. So, for example, if I was to play a younger child, obviously I'm not a young child, so I would change the pitch of my voice to suit that characterization there. Okay, so high or low. Pause. Pause is when you use little spaces to make something stand out. It's another way of emphasizing that we've already talked about. And this can happen before or after you say something. Okay, often used for dramatic effect. So, to hold suspense, for example. But pause is quite effective. Projection. Projection is when you are raising your voice but not shouting. So I'm actually projecting now. I'm talking from my diaphragm, so I'm not talking from my lungs. which means that my voice is naturally louder, but it doesn't sound like I'm shouting. Okay, this is so when you're acting, everyone can hear you. Those of you that have been in shows and productions before, you know that projection is quite key because you want that bit of audience sat right at the back to be able to hear you. This is especially important for historical pieces of theatre or when you're in a theatre without a microphone. So projection. Now bear in mind, you guys, when you do your GCSE assessments, you won't have microphones, so we've got to work on those projection skills. Tone. Tone is how you change your voice to show an emotion of a character. So, for example, you could speak in an angry tone of voice, and it just means that you change your voice to make it sound like you're angry. Very simply. Also, this is used for things such as sarcasm and other kind of language traits that you might already know. Tone is one of them that is quite easy to use as a keyword because you can just show the emotion of that character. So you can say they would use a nervous tone of voice. The important thing about tone is you have to kind of give an example afterwards. So if they're using a nervous tone of voice, they might also use pause in there to show those added nerves. So they might talk with fast pace, pause, that shows they have a nervous tone of voice. Cool. Breath. Breath is weird to think about as a verbal skill because often you don't really speak when you're breathing, but breath is one of the easiest things you can do to show a character's emotion. Okay, so if they're frustrated, you can let out a sigh. If they're panicky, you can show through sharp intakes of breath how they're panicking, and it's so easy to use breath. Again, this shows emphasis, this can add to a pause. It's so multifunctional. Don't forget about breath. I'm just going to move on to my next ones to talk to you about. Repetition. Now, often you have characters using repetition, again, when they're nervous or angry, or sometimes the language of a script already has repetition in there. But it is actually a vocal skill. And the important thing about repetition is you might have heard of the power of three before, is to kind of make a point. See, I said to make a point, repetition. It's like I planned that. I didn't. And it can be really, really useful as well in terms of creating your characterization. Characterization is one for another time, but how you kind of sum up your character. Cueing. Now, vocal cues are quite important. So this isn't like cueing where you stand in a line and wait for your turn. This is actually spelled C-U-E-I-N-G. And this is when you kind of let other actors or maybe backstage crew or lighting crews, whatever, let them know when it's their turn to do something. So for example, you might have a vocal cue where you shout something and then the lights turn like to a really dramatic red. That's an example of cueing. Inflection. Now, inflection is something that a lot of people do subconsciously. And what that means is basically how your voice kind of goes up or down within a sentence. So you heard it then, I went up or down. That is me using inflections. And the most common use of inflection is when you ask a question. Because when you ask a question, your voice kind of goes up at the end. Where the question mark is, you naturally go, oh, yeah, that's it. Inflecting up, inflecting down. Staccato. Okay, so this is one that you might have heard from music, but it's basically short, sharp, distinct sounds. Short, sharp, distinct sounds. Okay, so for example, if I'm showing a character's making a point, I might use a staccato voice. Okay, short, sharp, short. That's a mouthful. Ironically, I'm going to now move on to articulation. Articulation is when you are saying your words nice and clearly and accurately. So it's a little bit different to clarity, because clarity is just speaking clearly, whereas articulation is saying the words accurately. So the biggest example of this is people saying don't instead of do not. They're not articulating their words. You might have seen actors do really weird vocal exercises, or those of you that know High School Musical, where Sharpay and Ryan are doing all of this kind of thing. That is to practice their articulation. Intonation. Okay, intonation. This is the space in between words. Okay, so a little bit similar to staccato, where it's the short, sharp sounding words, tongue twister. Intonation is purposely putting spaces in between words. So if you want to show a character is thinking, you would put intonations in there, so it shows what that character is doing. Again, also works with things like sarcasm, or when you're showing a character's emotions. So, you know, if they are angry, they might put intonations in there. Okay. I'm trying to think which ones I haven't done. Accent and dialect. So accent, again, is probably one you've heard of before. This is when you change your voice to sound like a person from a different area to what you are. So, for example, I have quite a Yorkshire accent, and I might change that if I was doing a more formal play. I might use RP, which is Royal Pronunciation, where it's basically the Queen's English, and I would make sure that my articulation and other things are organised and sorted. Okay, so accent. Dialect is very similar to accent, but is more about kind of regions rather than just generic overall, like French accent, for example. So dialect talks about the different phrases and ways of saying stuff. So, for example, for Yorkshire, we have phrases like, oh, it's black over Bill's mother's, for example. And if you don't know what that means, it basically means there's grey clouds in the distance. But that's me using my dialect, and I said over instead of over. So it's changing the way that you use your voice. So, oh, it's like Blackpool illuminations in here. Example of using a dialect. Cadence. This is one that's actually used quite a bit in rap, and it's about the rhythm of your voice. So in rap, for example, to quote Hamilton, I'm the model of a modern major general, a Virginian veteran whose men are all lining up. That's the pattern. It's repetitive. It goes over and over. And you can swap your cadence around so that you might speak with a normal pattern, but then it changes. Cadence is very similar to iambic pentameter. Those of you that have done Shakespeare, or maybe are moving on to Shakespeare in English, which is the pattern that you speak. So if music be the food of love, play on. Okay, that's an example of iambic pentameter. Which one haven't I looked at yet? Juxtaposition. This is one that I use quite often in drama, and juxtaposition is basically a contrast to what the audience is expecting. So remember that contrast is something significantly different put together for an effect. Juxtaposition is just basically an extension of that, and it's a fancy word to put in your exams. So for example, for juxtaposition, if a character just died and you used a happy tone of voice, that would be a juxtaposition, because often you expect if someone dies that you're sad. Okay, I hope that's been useful. This video can be rewound and paused and all that if you haven't done that already. So please keep refreshing your mind over these keywords that we've looked at, and hopefully that will help with your written exam and also your Component 1 portfolio, where you're talking about your devising process and some of the considerations that you put towards your final product. Thank you for watching.